if that doesn't mean anything, it means this is that, we're going to talk about things that most people won't talk about. We're going to ask questions that most people refuse to. And that's been my nature all my life. So, we're going to open some more nuts here.
Nice.
Well, I relate to you, brother. I served in the Navy too. I was an Airedale myself.
I know, but I follow it. I see you in that squid.
Yeah.
So we're on the same page.
Right on.
Yeah. A bunch of us nukes had problems with security clearances and things like that, especially if you had any fighting, boxing background at all, in the service back then and stuff. So.
Oh, the smokers, yeah.
Yeah.
Would you want someone who can fight, like in the military? Just thinking, like, why would that skill be? I mean, I can understand if you had a criminal record, but this seems logical. Like, so I took boxing. Oh, well, you're a security clearance. I just can't envision what it would be,
No, it's only if you apply that skill while you're in the service.
Okay. Oh, only if you knock out an officer. I getcha. Welcome to the January 13th edition of the Electric View. I'm Neil Thompson. Today we have Edwin, Robert, Heather, Buddy, Richard, Eugene, Shifu, Jim, James, Dave, and our very special guest, Chris Fontenot. We explore the background and history of the ideas behind co-opted electrical science and what may be in store for our future. Please take a moment to like and subscribe.
It's great to meet everyone. Nice talking to everyone. Is that Eugene there?
Yeah, looks like that.
Hey, Eugene.
James is here too.
I still have that card you gave me at the conference in 2015. It's sitting on my visor of my Jeep.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. When I look up there, occasionally I'll see it and remind me of you. It's good to see it. Good to see you again. Talk to you again.
Yeah, I'm also glad that you've been able to join us. Yeah.
Thank you. I've been following all your work. You're just truly amazing. Your level of understanding and rational thinking is, brings me around back home sometimes. It makes me dig deeper, for answers. So that's good. That's a good thing.
Yeah, that's what we do in this community,
Right.
Trying to dig deeper, right?
Absolutely.
Looking for answers.
Well, it was almost 4 years ago when I said to you that I see you as a future leader in the electric universe community, and I think you've come into your own since then. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Although my personality is certainly not that of a leader. I prefer, research to more administrative work or something like that. So.
Well, when you're cutting edge, you can't help but lead.
It's true. People look up to you, and you didn't think they were. You were like, I'm surprised when someone comes up and goes, "I've been watching blah blah blah." I'm like, really? These are just my friends, and we're just hanging out. But if you think that we're awesome, that's great. It makes me feel good.
Absolutely, great discussions. I follow y'all's podcast as well, and listen to just about everything. I was watching that recent thing y'all were doing on the entry of that comet trajectory and everything. That was a brilliant discussion.
That is pretty awesome.
It's been pretty exciting to see that all coming together. So with Jim and Eugene and stuff, it's really cool.
Absolutely.
So I hope you could join our Skype group because that gets lively throughout the week. It goes through different cycles of activity and stuff. But the ideas are always pretty fun to interact with, and everyone's ideas.
Sounds wonderful.
We don't always have like a big like an interview like this. Sometimes we're having just a regular conversation. So.
Well, I think the only quote is attributed to Einstein that I ever repeat is that we're only limited by what we know, and our imagination has no limit. So I would ask you guys just to bear with me. These are concepts that were established and ideas that were pervade long before I lived, and we're going to have an open discussion on them. Hopefully we can get to the bottom of it, or at least shed some light on how it's possible, if it's possible.
I am up for that.
Yeah.
So, Dave,
I just went through some. I went through some of the material on your Facebook page, etc. So I'm kind of into the idea of whatever's going to inspire like a discussion or a direction that you'd like to talk about today. We can kind of follow that, and there's some really fascinating things that you discuss here, and there's certainly things that are scary in the process. And but I think it's certainly worth addressing and bringing to light, and at least different perspectives on them. So.
Absolutely. Well, I think the gist of the discussion today will be based on Tesla's quote, and I'll reference this.
I have one here that I saw.
Yeah, man could tap the breast of Mother Sun and release her energy toward Earth as needed, magnetic as well as light, end quote. And I think that, I think that is the answer. That's the big question. How do we do that? So can we do that? Is it possible for mankind to affect in any way the function of a sun? So our sun. Mm-hmm. And that's where I'd like to begin the conversation about how does the Earth obtain its electrical potential? What creates the heat in the atmosphere of the Earth and the sun? What is alphan ohmic heating, ionic heating occurring in the upper atmosphere of Earth and the sun? So, and we know about the Berkland current filament connection. So we'll probably need to talk about how it's a phase locked loop circuit and the possibility of perturbing that circuit through out of phase sequence. Perturbation of our upper atmosphere. So Alphen waves, everyone's familiar with Hannes Alphen's work and magnetohydrodynamics. And I think the only thing that he did come out after was awarded a Nobel Prize was that they were not frozen in lines of magnetic force. So I agree with that. And so we can get past that discussion about how he rejected his own theory and move on to how the theory is actually in application right now. So I don't want to occupy the mic that entire time of discussion, but what I would like to say is that who is familiar with research in Alphen wave and ionospheric perturbations?
I would say I'm a little bit. I think a lot of us have played around.
A little bit too.
Yeah, we played around with it. We talked. I'm pretty sure that me, Jim, and Eugene, and others have talked about atmospheric connections, especially with regards to the sun, or just trying to figure out the circuits and so forth. So,
okay. Well, typically, the first high altitude nuclear detonations created Alphen wave perturbations, and that was in the late 50s, I believe, was the first ones. Argus, I believe, was one of the first attempts that was publicized. So, we think about how this is possible to create a cluster of ions traveling around a waveguide circuit in the, circumnavigating the planet. And in fact, that's what we talk about, the Schumann resonance and how they're created, and elves and sprites and all these other phenomena are a product of that electric force created through an Alphen wave circuit traveling around the Earth in dynamic motion that creates that electrical force. So, I believe it works both ways. It's a swinging door, so we can actually induce a circuit, or that circuit an electric force can induce a magnetic field. So magnetic field can induce an electrical circuit, or electrical circuit can induce a magnetic field. One and the same, they have to be there. So I think that's the discussion to have, is how does anthropogenic space weather, the artificial perturbation of Alphen waves in Earth's upper atmosphere, affect not only our own planet, but the sun itself? And in that conversation, I think is possible through the understanding of Berkland filament connections and their structure, as discussed by Don Scott, that we may be able to understand that connection and how mankind possibly can affect his environment in such a way.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Nice.
So, when you talk about the Earth's atmospheric conductivity and research on ion measurements in the atmosphere and what the counts are, and in fact, Clifford Cornicom did some research on atmospheric conductivity. He's done a lot of other research as well on Morgellons disease and other things, but I think his research on atmospheric conductivity is the most critical point to make, as he's determined that over a period of time that he did his studies, that he detected a 233% increase in ions in the atmosphere. So how does that affect us? Is the atmosphere, are we swimming in electromagnetic radiation? Yes. Is all of it natural? No. What effect does it have on humanity? Is there a biological effect from non-ionizing radiation? Absolutely. How does it occur? Well, you study the research on voltage-gated ion channeling in the body and how electromagnetic radiation affects the mitochondrial double layers, just exactly the way it does in the upper atmosphere. So, the discussion is to understand how we're tuned in to this electrical circuit, and the body, the earth, and all life on it exist at the behest of those frequencies. Our hearts and our minds resonate to the vibrations of the Schumann cavity. So how does that Schumann cavity vibrate? What causes that vibration? So I'm opening a door for a lot of questions. Mainstream scientists say that lightning causes alpha waves. And like I said, I believe a lightning strike can perturb an alpha wave. But is that the predominant factor in which it happens? I doubt it. I think it's an electrical force from exterior of the planet, the sun, that powers this phenomenon of the upper atmosphere, and even the thermal radiation that's emitted in the upper atmosphere. We're talking about temperatures of 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. We're talking about alpha temperatures. So what can they exist as, and what electron dope potential do they have? Well, they're significant. In fact, it's very possible that those perturbations cause heating in the upper atmosphere, which is the predominant cause of heating or cooling on our planet. So at what rate are they doing it, and how long they've been doing it, and why isn't that a part of the conversation on climate change? That's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Do you think we're just locked into the model, the existing model?
Absolutely. They found out how it worked. They figured out how it worked. They're just not telling anybody.
That's always been my, kind of, there's a premise of like a knowledge or a feeling, more of a feeling that's how it is. But do you have support for that? That it feels to me that it's been known for a long time. It's just, this is a model that they built in order to contain everyone's, way of looking at the universe.
I think it's an ancient knowledge. I think we've now figured out how to do it with modern technology. I think the pyramids, in some fashion, maintain an oscillation of the planet, maybe balance, maybe electrical tensions between points in space. I don't know. There's a lot of questions out there, but I don't believe they were burial chambers.
No, right.
Could they have created oscillations within the Schumann cavity as an interface between telluric currents and atmospheric currents, ionospheric currents? Possibly. I think that's the question: is how does the interface occur? We know that there's a precursor and high total electron content above epicenters of earthquakes around the world. They study that, and they indicate that it happens as a practice. So how is it possible that the natural phenomena can be duplicated and recreated artificially? And if they are doing it artificially to create movement of seismic plates, or I don't believe in tectonic plates, but in a case to create vibrations underneath the planet, is it possible they're doing it to prevent a larger earthquake from occurring? I don't know. Are they saving us, or are they just trying to control it?
Right. Right.
So essentially, you're saying that there is some they who know all this stuff, but how can they contain this knowledge? I mean, why isn't it spreading out or something?
Well,
It's interesting that you say that, because I also had that same thought, and it was like, if you're talking about like an energetic connectivity between everyone, and at one point some sort of knowledge is unlocked or understood, then that vibration will ripple through the connectivity of everyone, which would make everyone more receptive to it and open to it, and people start having realizations along the lines of what they know without them having to tell us. Right?
Well, I think those are good questions, and here's the thing is that when I speak in terms of they, I'm talking about the people that collectively, that Tesla said and spoke publicly about, that those locations around the planet would have to come together, and those locations, in fact, were plotted in a study that I saw on where the ionospheric heaters would have to be located geographically, and all those locations had to come under one wing of management. Who runs that? I know the World Meteorological Organization sponsors the proliferation of dipole phased array radar systems around the globe. They fund it. We know that does. In fact, I just posted this morning an article on what they call non-ionizing radiation radar in a pencil beam formation, creating ionization potential. So I'm saying is that they're saying it's non-ionizing. If it does cause an electron to be ejected from a molecule or an atom, then it is ionizing, and therefore we can determine what the cascade effect might be, what the charge separation might be in the atmosphere with the use of dipole phased array systems. All these things are questions. So how it all comes together is a million pieces of the puzzle. How the Earth is charged electrically. We know it's externally powered typically, but can we manifest a recreation of that natural phenomena? And I say yes, they are. And it's open for discussion. I'm putting it on the table.
What's the motivation for what they're doing? To me, there's quite a few data points here, and I'm not sure which one to pull out first. But
I think the idea is control, and he who controls the sun controls life on planet Earth. Mm-hmm. So, and throughout the solar system. So, control of the electrical circuit, and what we're talking about in the past is someone said something about the Saturn being more luminous than the sun, right? Well, in fact, the data shows that Earth is more luminous than the sun right now in the microwave spectrum.
That is true. We give off a lot of microwaves.
Absolutely. So I'm saying, is it in which light and
what type of luminosity, what range of luminosity?
What spectrum of light are we observing these phenomena?
It was Robitaille, wasn't it, who did who was the one who pointed out that the water of our planet gives off a lot of microwaves.
The cosmic microwave background is a product of the oceans. That's right.
I thought that was a brilliant idea because of the way that his proof had to do with the way the layout was and the way that the satellite was turning. I thought that was brilliant.
Absolutely genius stuff. And Robitaille truly is a brilliant man. I don't necessarily agree with all of his theories on liquid metal, and I don't. Wall just said last week that he didn't either. So,
but there's no reason to worry about that. I mean, there's minor things.
As long as it's an externally powered phenomena, I'm down to discuss an anode sun or a plasmoid sun, which, in my opinion, is more likely the product of what I see. And, there's research on the topic of plasmoid phenomena on the sun, and we talk about throughout the universe as the plasmoids or the power. Steve Smith and I are about an hour and a half apart, and we visited a number of times and here at my house, and we've talked about the plasmoid phenomenon. For my birthday a couple of years ago, he posted that video out, and I was glad to know that our conversation had an impact.
Oh, that's good. But
the kind of electric plasmoid sun does not contradict Robitaille's model. In fact, they might support each other.
That's exactly what I said, Eugene. I said they neither were mutually exclusive, so there was no reason to argue the model. I'm just saying is that if we do talk about the phenomena of a plasmoid sun and we talk about it as a condensed matter phenomena, I'm not sure if that contradicts or not. I'd have to probably speak with Robitaille directly to see how he felt about it.
And we were talking about this just a moment ago. Eugene posted something around the 3,000, the atmosphere depth of Jupiter, and how they say it's not really a solid body, but it acts like a solid body at that depth, and we were like kind of laughing, you know.
Yeah, so just to fill everyone in, so to speak, this Juno space probe that is orbiting Jupiter right now, so they've found with their measurements of gravity and magnetism around Jupiter that beyond, like below 3,000 kilometers off the top of the atmosphere, the Jupiter rotates like a solid body. So it's like a rigid ball. So there's no differential rotation anymore, no things like that. And so, well, it was actually kind of my idea, not only mine probably, but I was considering Jupiter as being a solid body, not a gas giant, So it kind of confirmed this idea. But of course, again, NASA scientists, they say that, it must be, liquid or gas, but it's just, it's just rotating like a solid body because there's magnetism or something else involved and things like that. But what it seems to be is actually a solid body. But at the atmosphere above, those 3,000 kilometers of atmosphere, they actually demonstrate this counter rotation that, Don Scott's Berkland currents have. So this is another very interesting point. And I have to note that on Earth, we also have counter-rotating atmospheric areas, these cells of global circulation, which both Jupiter and Earth, in this case, this counter-rotation might be an evidence for some sort of kind of like Berkland current, falling in from the poles. But that is so far an intuitive notion rather than an actual observable fact. I mean, to say there's a Berkland current, we need to actually register this current in some way. I mean, maybe there's some particles that we don't yet know about, or some types of fields that we don't yet know about, or don't have a method of detection,
Eugene, I think
to be researched.
I think NASA actually does. In fact, what I see is NASA's recording magnetic fields, right? And all the magnetic fields we know are a product of an electric force. So if we know the magnetic field is a product of an electric force, then we have to wonder if it may be scalable. Is there an order of magnitude? Is there a smaller force occurring that is representative of the electric field that we observe? So maybe it's a dipole moment in the ether that we're observing as these connecting phenomena, along a Berkland current center core filament. I don't know. I love the model Don Scott came up with. I appreciate all he's done, and wow, what a addition to the electric universe.
Yeah, we've actually had a brief discussion on this in some of the earlier podcasts. So the topic was, can we actually detect, do we even able, with having only those tiny space probes, are we actually able to detect some, large scale fields or those types of currents or fields that are spanning the whole planet, basically? Because maybe if the probe is just measuring something in one point, it would measure, the same kind of field all around it, even though on the larger scale, there would be a much more significant, potential difference or whatever. And we would just not be able to measure that because we only have, this one data point at some point in space.
I agree, and we tend to observe the planets around us to try to understand, I guess, how our own planet works. When in reality, there's significant atmospheric research, upper atmospheric research that's going on that has detected D1, D2 satellite missions, polar satellites, the TIDE satellite missions as well detected ion acceleration from both poles. In fact, they detected water exhausting out of both poles at a considerable rate. So the range of that radii was 8.5 Earth radii from the poles, above the poles, as they observed that ion acceleration, and considerable acceleration, I might add. You look at the work down in the South Pole and all the ionospheric research taking place down there, and I think it's a deep the Cube project, where they're measuring neutrinos, and the recent discovery of a phenomena that's accelerating ions from deep within the Earth, and they're detecting it from the wrong direction, or it's coming completely through the Earth. You guys see that report?
Yeah, so I just have one kind of brief, a small addition to what I've already said. So I think the only occasion when people actually kind of tried to deal with those slightly larger scale phenomena, at least of tens of kilometers in size, was with the Tether Experiments in Earth's orbit in space shuttle missions. And you probably know how that ended, right? So
yes.
At one time they didn't deploy the tether. Well, okay, that's not really related. But on other occasion, it just fried from the electric currents that were running through it, and it was only like maybe 10 or 20 kilometers long, or maybe even 2 kilometers. I'm not sure.
They actually did perturb an alpha wave from the Tether Experiments as well, Eugene. I don't know if you're familiar with that research.
I didn't know. Huh?
Yeah, they actually did. There was an alpha wave. That's another mechanism by which to perturb an alpha wave in the upper atmosphere is through a tether. So, it's interesting that all these research and all the studies that I see of the upper atmosphere of Earth are designed to understand how the ionospheric radiation belts, or the layers of the ionosphere, interact, or what they're calling this couple, right, with the magnetosphere and the thermosphere of Earth, and therefore, how that coupling effect occurs. I think they're really searching for that Berkland current filament connection, because everything they're observing is saying that there's definitely an acceleration to and from Earth to the sun. That's my opinion on that, anyway.
Well, you're probably like, this is the thing. Me and Dave have this wonderful argument all the time. Is it intentional, like you guys, or is it? I tend to lead on the side of ignorance first, but still, there's. I mean, you'd think that somebody at like JPL would like get like a little inkling, or NASA would look up and go, huh. So there's a little bit to what you say. I mean, it's clear that they're not telling you absolutely everything. I mean, it's not like we all knew that when the space shuttle was made, they were advertising it as a space plane. But little did we know that their main goal was to grab satellites out of orbit, Russia or other country satellites, and work on them and put them back into space. And no one even thought about that, but, they did. But
yeah.
Anyway, I just wanted to add before we go. I just wanted to point out your wonderful situation there. The reason that it's really a concern about the solid surface part is because of the mass of these bodies, the Jupiter and the Sun. The big conundrum is, how can something be solid yet be so light, or according to the gravity that's supposed to have, or mass. So, but that's the main conundrum. I'll leave you to go then. Sorry.
Right on. Well, we're talking about, I think the point of discussion was, how does how does mankind interface with our environment? And is it possible for us to manipulate solar activity, or even, for that matter, anthropogenic space weather? And there's a number of different studies recently on that topic of upper atmospheric research, and how the angle of perturbation of the electrojets perturb either the blowout or create stabilized plasmoid phenomena in the upper atmosphere. So we're looking at collisional and collisionless plasmoid phenomena in the upper atmosphere. I'm calling it a plasmoid instability in the upper atmosphere of Earth, very similar to what I think we've seen at the center of the galaxy, and how that phenomena may or may not be manipulated, artificially. So I think it's important to consider what the possibility are with solar radiation management and how that might affect the atmospheric conductivity with aerosol particulates and nanoparticulates dispersed artificially and naturally. Fires and volcanoes disperse the most aerosols, I think. And we know the studies of certain scientists that discovered cosmic radiation interface with aerosols create cloud formations. And how does that affect weather? There was a company, Aqueous, that did work on directing atmospheric rivers, essentially pushing water into regions that don't normally see that atmospheric river overhead. So, and creating rainfall.
The Chinese have now started a large geoengineering project, especially designed to bring rainfall to some of the deserts in northwest of China. Maybe you've heard about that?
I have. In fact, I see a lot of finger pointing on that note, Eugene. We're saying that Russia's doing it. We're saying Chinese did it for the Olympics there, that they cleared the sky, and they say how they did it with cannon fire and rockets and other things. So I don't know. They're not revealing the electromagnetic component to the whole idea of geoengineering. They're talking about the aerosol dispersion. And now it's publicly recognized that it's going on, right? So, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I started talking about geoengineering and chemtrailing is what it was called back then. But that's not a term that the conspiracy theorists made up. That was in a Air Force document. That's where that was picked up from. So anyway, I'm not so much concerned about me being validated on the topic of artificially, spraying nanoparticulates or aerosols or dispersing them artificially. There's a natural phenomena that occur that disperse far more than chemtrails could. But, fires, we've been having fires in Northern California. That's a concern. What is the spark gap, right? Standard for power lines now. Is it changed? We know that the atmospheric conductivity has increased. Is that reflective in our standards for our power lines? Those are good questions.
Yeah, well, I would like to briefly return to the topic of possible, control of solar activity.
Yes.
Although, yeah, I'm not claiming anything. I just want to hear your opinion. Have you heard about the phenomenon of Earth-facing solar quiet that Ben Davidson frequently talks about? So just again, for everyone to understand what I mean by that, it's the observation that somehow sunspots very rarely produce strong flares towards the Earth, and coronal mass ejections too. So and I've actually observed that a lot of times. Like the sunspot appears at the eastern limb, it starts flaring like really violently. For example, if there's a period of high solar activity, but then when it kind of moves towards the center of the sun, so that it's directly against the Earth, it suddenly kind of quiets down, and then when it moves away from Earth again to the opposite side of the sun, it starts flaring again. So, do you think there might be some connections to what humans are doing on this planet? Or
well, Eugene, that's a brilliant observation, and the fact is that Tesla covered that in that quote. He said man could tap the breast of Mother Sun and release energy towards Earth as needed, right? Magnetic as well as light. And so I'm saying that we've obviously determined that we could maybe induce potential along another collimated beamform through directed energy technology and create some type of perturbation on the sun toward another planet. We know that NASA's observed climate change on other planets. So a while back there was a study that was saying that climate change on other planets is going through the roof. So we know there's a change going on, whether it's a natural phenomena. I think there is a natural long-term cycle. Are we trying to determine how that occurs and how to control it? Possibly. I think they are trying to learn how to control it. Whether they're trying to control it for our benefit or for our demise, that's another question.
Yeah, I actually wanted to propose alternative possibility for why that is observed, and that is actually heavily dependent on the Robitaille's model. Although maybe not quite, but that's where I got this idea from. And it's not because Robitaille speaks about that, but because, his ideas drove me to this thought that maybe it's actually an effect of, so if the sun is condensed matter, it means that it should emit anisotropically. So its emission would depend on direction, right?
Right.
So it might the power of the emitted radiation would depend on direction, the direction from which you're observing it. So maybe there is also an anisotropy in the X-ray flux during the solar flare, so that when it is observed at the limb of the sun, it leads to higher flux than when the flaring is happening directly towards us, So it might be this anisotropical effect of the observer, if you like, of the angle of observation.
Oh, that's
That was another idea I've had, a couple of years ago.
Well, that's a brilliant observation. Like I say, Eugene, that's the point of getting into these discussions, is there's perspectives on how this may occur or how it may not occur. And those perspectives is what's going to direct us to the answers that are being forwarded right now within the electric universe community and within the geoengineering community. So that's where the crossover is. And how do these changes, right, in our electromagnetic environment through the solar calm or through increased solar activity, how does that affect mankind? I've seen studies conducted in Scandinavia where they've shown where spontaneous abortions were increased considerably during solar flare activity. Now, we need to talk about these things if we're talking about a sun having that sort of impact on humanity and life on this planet. So, the process of geoengineering a planet, of changing the life on this planet, essentially our climate, involves the electromagnetic spectrum. And for the electric universe to be devoid of this conversation seems a bit obvious to me that we're missing something. So,
may I jump in for just 1 second?
Please do.
You all were just talking about a mechanism for this guided energy work, and I just finished reviewing this laser-guided energy discharges over large air gaps, and I had previously had this thought that we may be able to actually borrow asteroids from the asteroid belt and post charge collection stations throughout the solar wind, instead of trying to induce solar flares, but actually collect the charge and then at certain times basically just beam it back. I mean, they were talking about in here 200 to 400% increase in distance versus gapping. So that might be the solution.
Right now, I think the commercial rollout of technology that's been developed covertly, probably most likely through DARPA and other research facilities, even universities have done a lot of this work, and now it's being publicized, that we can start to understand how plasma ion channeling, for instance, may increase across the atmosphere that's more conductive. So we looked at Solarin, for instance, a corporation that just recently, in 2016, started delivering 250 megawatts of electricity to PG&E in California. And they were doing it with solar-powered satellite systems. And they signed the contract in 2009. If you guys been following the fires out here in California, 2016 was not a good year. We had a lot of fires, and last year again. And this year, hell, everything burned. So, there is some consideration for what the effects are on the power grid or induced currents into the circuit through scatter, for instance. If you beam a microwave signal down to a platform on Earth, what is the scatter through the atmosphere, through the ionosphere? How much of that energy is lost? Well, they're showing efficiencies of 90%, is what Solarin's saying. Some Japanese are saying that's far-fetched, but that's what Solarin reported and got permitted by the state permitters on their technology. So, we're far more advanced now than being told to the vast majority of the population. How that's developing and where we're going with that technology from here, and how it's going to affect life on this planet is obviously a conversation that we need to have. So, good point about, how that laser may facilitate that gap, that spark gap.
Mm-hmm. That was one thing that came through. Buddy shared that the other day with the plasma discharge. Do you happen to have a link to that little video, Buddy?
I don't, unfortunately.
Okay, it's great.
But yeah, laser guided electrical impulse signals, I think.
Right. All right. Just really interesting. Just kind of along the lines of what we've been discussing, just as a general phenomena.
They just released. I just saw a publication this week on. They induced a potential in a thunderstorm to create lightning strikes with lasers from ground positions.
Mm-hmm.
We know that Star Wars programs, initially it was designed to create some type of protective shielding in space through advanced technology, and now it seems like it all went away. We don't know much about what direction it went and what the technology is, but we also know that masers exist in space. Telstar, for instance, has a maser communication satellite in space, and I'm sure there's a number of others that are in military application that we're not familiar with. And the possibility of essentially beaming a laser to Earth and creating a plasma ion channel for discharge of ionospheric potential is there. So a thunderbolt of the gods, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Directed energy,
Right.
They're putting laser beams on buildings now to direct lightning strikes to ground away from critical equipment. So, a lot of information there.
Right.
How they're using it, how they're not using it. Is it possible to induce potential into a hurricane? Well, that's a good question. Can you create a volcanic activity with induction of current or what they're calling a magnetic connection between the ionosphere and Taylor currents? So, I don't know. I think the research is there for more questions to be asked, but obviously that stuff is not going to be something they're going to publicize.
Right. I was watching this thing just to read on this because it just struck my mind. But the winding of this tornado, you can see it tighten right before that strike. And there's an angular momentum thing to me. This angular momentum keeps playing my mind for some reason.
You guys heard of a light phenomenon at the center of tornadoes? Victims of tornadoes have recorded and witnessed lightning phenomena in the core of a tornado. Have you guys heard of this?
I've also heard about the someone seeing the inside of the tornado itself was glowing. much akin to what we were talking about with when Andy was on a while ago. We were showing clouds that had a blue glow behind them, that type of thing. So I think that's a sure sign that, at this point, it's kind of odd. It's not considered electrical, but we noticed the similarity if you have an opportunity to listen to any of the times when Jim has a chance to speak. And there was this wonderful thing he was talking about, the way the sun sits along the local chimney, and it just became obvious to me that that's this kind of a similar situation we're seeing with tornadoes, the way that things can stick to the outside of a tornado, apparently, at like even like a semi truck, then fall like later. Like it's just certainly not wind alone that is doing this, clearly. But
I want to read Andy Hall's Eye of the Storm Part 3. He just released, and that talks about cyclones and mega anvil clouds and everything, and how they circle back and forth. Pretty cool.
Great article. I just read it, Robert. Great article.
Right.
Yeah.
But clearly, definitely, we see something inside of tornadoes. I think we were even in the movie Twister. It was like that Bill Paxton was looking up and he saw something. Of course, that's a movie, but I guess it was based on a similar idea that there were stories, there were tales. No one's actually sort of had a camera or their cell phone out going, yeah, I'm just getting run over by a tornado. We're just going to film this and show you what it looks like. Everything will be fine. I think the only person I even knew that tried to do something like that was Garrett Hill, who that gentleman who was doing electrical experiments and describing them at EU 2017, and he but we were having a conversation with him in private, and one of the things that he was talking about was chasing tornadoes, and his idea, he was on a motorcycle with basically protective armor and tried to get as close as they could to the tornado, and unfortunately I would say fortunately, they got scared after the truck was almost destroyed and ran away. So I give them thanks for being around to tell me the tale. That's what I'm saying. So brave boys. I'd be like running for my life, I'm sure.
You can do that apparently for only like $1,600. Go out there for a week, and they include meals, and they'll drive you around for a week and go storm chasing in America here.
I don't have to chase a storm. Seems like they came to me. I rode out.
$1,600. Yeah.
I rode out Katrina on my houseboat in Dog River, Alabama. Wow. It blew.
Oh man.
Blew 127 knots there at the marina. So, I love bad weather. I don't seek it out, but I've been through a lot of it, and rode out Ivan and a few other storms as well. And I can tell you, there's been a lot of talk about how to manipulate, how to create movement in a storm. And it seems to me in electric universe, if it's possible for Doppler, next-rad radar systems, a dipole system, to affect or ionize an atmosphere, a cloud bank, or is it possible for a laser, for that matter, or a maser to induce potential in the atmosphere? Wouldn't that create movement of clouds through charge separation?
Well, I do know that we do put, like, that's how you make those like cool fractal patterns in plexiglass. They use ion beams to ionize the middle of the glass, but not the edges. And that's how it makes a capacitor, and that's how you make that effect on the inside. So I can picture that you could sort of beam ions, and that should, just via Coulomb's law, once you start putting them there, they're going to affect charge in their general vicinity. So that makes sense. That checks out.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I have electrical background. Well, but, I don't attest to be an electrical engineer. You guys are way smarter than me. Right? I've had to fix things you guys I couldn't have designed anything you guys did, but I've had to fix it a lot.
that shows our stupidity usually.
Well, I'm surrounded by really intelligent people most of my life, and I've been fortunate. My dad was electrical. He was an electrician studying electrical engineering, owned an electrical contracting company and stuff. So, I've been around it pulling wire since I was 8 years old.
Okay, nice.
I had to learn a little bit along the way. And he was
we get stuck in the theory and get way away from reality,
Yeah.
And then it's like okay, how do we possibly show one instance of this theory?
Yeah. Well, I think it was interesting. I watched someone mention the other day that in electrical theory you get very little. I think it was Ken Wheeler talking about electrical theory and electrical engineers how little on essentially longitudinal waveforms, scalar waves, and any of that sort of thing. We talk about electrons and the movement of electrons as electricity, but what about protons? And how does proton pumping occur in the upper atmosphere? And for that matter, how does proton pumping occur in the body, the human?
Right. This is the one. Yeah. I mean, it seems that it's very incomplete, and then it's been stopped to me. I'm seeing right around the turn of the century, there was so much interest in just electrical investigation and experimentation and exploration, and then the physicists got a hold of it, and then they kind of locked the whole thing down, and the innovation in that exploration kind of halted dramatically.
I'm all for it. Edwin continuing his research and study into the structure of the atom, because if we determine that it is in fact some sort of plasmoid instability in scale from the subatomic particle all the way up to plasmoid instability at the center of the galaxy and the sun and the center of the earth, and the collisionless plasmoid instability that occurs at times in the upper atmosphere of the earth. So, the idea that we need a new model for all these things to better understand them, the photoelectric effect and how that occurs, I think we need to look into Bostic's work further on the plasmoid instabilities.
Yeah.
So I love
just looking at that, actually.
Bob Johnson's plasmoid revisiting of the sun, and I think he provided considerable insight for the electric universe community. I understand that Monty's doing good work with Sapphire. I appreciate that. All of it's going to give us a better understanding. So,
I have sort of a discussion starter, potentially at least. So kind of continuing this line that you, Dave, spoke about, that of shutting down, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious to hear everybody's opinion and Chris about. Well, I just have had this idea that, and it might be a pretty long thing that I'm going to speak about, but hear me out, please. So for example, we've had this fossil fuel climate change thing, right? When people basically use coal power plants, oil power plants, and things like that. But then we've had this Kyoto Protocol thing, this global warming propaganda and things like that. So that all became, people started, closing the power plants, and it caused many problems in different countries. Australia, for example, is in huge energetic crisis as far as I know, because they've got rid of all their coal plants, and so on and so forth. So I kind of envision the possibility that if those electrical influences would be recognized, if it would become like a super mainstream, don't you think that there may be sort of an electric Kyoto Protocol, if you like? When people would say that, okay, the electric devices actually pollute our environment so much that it becomes uninhabitable, so we should get rid of them. And this might be, sort of a possibility of starting a kind of a dark age, if you like. You see where I'm going with this?
I agree that the answer is not to fall back 100 years in our technological advancement. What I would say is the frequency that we use for communications could be different, and the oscillations that we transmit from all our devices and all our technology could reinforce life instead of diminish it. We know from the research studies that terahertz frequencies in airport scanners tear apart DNA, but we know that natural terahertz frequencies from the sun repair it. So that's the key, is recreating those natural frequencies that would induce good health instead of ill health in the population, and bring our planet into a healthy existence. Maybe even change our consciousness through this process of evolving the Schumann cavity oscillations.
Right.
Good question.
Yeah.
What's your feel?
Don't you think that it might be kind of, pushed to the limit by propaganda, even if it's not even correct in the first place, or not entirely correct?
Absolutely.
That's what I'm saying.
Absolutely, and there's studies for both sides, and they're funded from both sides. Unfortunately, the telecom industry has gotten a clean slate. They can do anything they want to, a blank check. And so the research, United Nations World Health Organization has listed cell phone radiation as a class 2 carcinogen. So we know that there's more and more research indicating that there is an effect, a biological effect, from non-ionizing radiation, which has been their argument of thermal exposure from cell phone microwave radiation. And that is a bogus argument, because there are other effects that are non-thermal. And that's the question we need to discuss.
What's your sense of what's going on with 5G and the rollout there, and what's the?
I think it's interesting. Good question. By the way, I just did a talk in Sacramento with Environmental Voices, and I discussed with them, because they are a 5G city, the ability. In fact, telecom industries across the board about 5 to 7 years ago started applying for application to deliver power remotely through wireless power transfer. And they started providing that. A San Diego company was granted a FCC license to do such with some of their devices. Now, 5G has the ability to direct an energy beam to a point. And if you use multiple transmitters to beam point energy to a specific point, for instance, a box in someone's house or on the wall, it's possible to transfer energy through that process. There's a company out of Waco, Texas named Visiv that just recently got application approved and has started producing a Xenic wave for remote power transfer globally. So they'll use this low frequency oscillation and as a waveguide to lure currents in the earth and transmit energy wirelessly. Essentially, my understanding is through driving a triad ground rod system into the ground and using their device.
Is that out of Milford, Texas?
Yeah, I think it is. And interesting. Yeah, that's it. And interestingly enough, there's a company that's associated with it, and their name is Berkland Current Limited, LLC.
They hear that. They hear it in the air. They pick it up. A different type of air they're picking that up in. So.
This stuff is I didn't think they'd allow this to roll out commercially for some time now. I've known about the technology for a long time and how the Tesla towers operated essentially by interfacing that energy between atmospheric, ionospheric currents and those telluric fields. But the fact that they're rolling it out now commercially tells me that there's going to be exponential growth in this knowledge, and the electric universe is poised right here, right now, to understand all that's going on in geoengineering and perhaps even control of our solar activity.
It seems to me like one of the things that I saw you mentioning on the podcast that I was watching was this use of just to kind of move a little bit to the HARP installation in Alaska, and then using basically creating a resonance and then to amplify an atmospheric effect on a massive scale, on a global scale. And it's like, this is that's a radical technology.
Yeah, I agree. And we talk about HARP as a idealized facility, but there are much larger, in fact, dozens and dozens of ionospheric heaters globally. Even my understanding is one of the largest is down in Antarctica, built just recently, but I haven't seen any documentation on it. So, but we've had dipole phased array antennas at different locations around the world for since the 50s we've been building. And the HARP facility in Alaska and Gacona, not far from where I lived, is just one of many.
Right. But the act of doing this, do they do it on a small scale in order to do it, or is it basically they're testing on just using the Earth as a lab rat?
It's an open air laboratory. These atmospheric tests have been going on for decades and decades, and in fact, the change in our electromagnetic environment and Schumann resonance is one of the consequences of those variations in alpha wave perturbations in the upper atmosphere. My understanding is NASA's admitted that they can create new waveguides. They said so when they admitted they created the third Van Allen belt, right? And that was done through, my understanding is high altitude nuclear detonations, but the same technology that was discovered then of creating an alpha wave perturbation.
Michael Claridge, actually, I think, was talking about that in one of his presentations when an extra ring formed from the nuclear explosion there in 1960-something. Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, that was the early days of discovery of how this system was operating. And
yes, it was
there was actually a very impactful paper in 2016 or 17, I guess. It was called something like anthropogenic space weather, or maybe some other words also were involved. So they discussed in detail how these high altitude nuclear explosions impacted the Earth and its immediate environment. In particular, yes, it injected lots of these charged particles that were released during the explosions into the Van Allen belts, and it actually damaged some of the satellites that were already in orbit at that time. Like, it was the very early 60s, so that there weren't many satellites, but still, some of them I think were even out of commission after that. So
brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
This is, by the way, this is a funny kind of additional argument towards, the lunar conspiracy. If anybody is interested in that, like in the 60s, really, the radiation belts were much, much more dense because of these explosions that we did. By we, I don't mean we, I mean humanity.
Yes. Brilliant. In fact, I think it's interesting to note that they've also experimented with controlling the radiation belts on ejection of matter and ejection of energy through that circuit. So they're essentially learning to induce charge potential in that electric field, waveguides in our upper atmosphere. And it seems to me, we were talking recently about the movement of the poles. And the North Pole seems to be moving erratically and all about, if you change the angle of perturbation and you create an elliptical waveguide, and in fact, electric force produces a magnetic field, wouldn't it be interesting to think that possibly the movement of the pole is related to the angle of perturbation of alpha waves in our upper atmosphere?
Well, not only, things on Earth are changing, but again, the sun is behaving quite irregularly in the sense that, the latest solar cycles are becoming weaker with respect to the 60s or 70s. the space age era. And there was actually a paper in 2014, I guess, that discussed a possible impact of that, of the weakening of the solar activity on the manned space flights, for example, towards Mars and stuff, because the dose of radiation during these long-term space flights, like maybe 6 months or more, is mostly due to the cosmic rays. And cosmic rays, the solar activity basically reduces cosmic rays. This is very, very well known, very well established correlation, or anti-correlation rather. So weakening solar activity would lead to more cosmic rays and much higher doses of radiation for astronauts, especially in these long-term flights, you know. So the point I'm making is that we see changes in the solar system, but it might be related to the Earth's magnetic field, not in the sense that Earth's magnetic field causes these changes, but vice versa, that, you know, everything changes, so Earth is also changing. And it's not, I mean, I think it would be really hard to prove that it's actually humans that are causing that, but who knows, again. Yeah, this is an open question.
I see, because I did some research on Cassini missions data and recording of background radiation, and they recorded a higher background radiation, cosmic radiation, when the sun was in inactive state. When the sun did flare, in fact, it was still lower than the background radiation of cosmic radiation at that distance from the sun. So, you know, I'm saying there's a lot of energy exchanging, you know, between the sun and other locations, and you just mentioned the Apollo missions and whether we had the ability to travel to those places then with the shielding available for those craft. I don't know. It's a good question, but it would be more related to the background radiation in space than the radiation in the Van Allen belts, because I see them as a shield, essentially, from higher radiation, higher energies from deep space.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if a few layers of mylar would protect somebody walking around on the moon's surface. That's all I'm saying.
It's amazing to me, you know, just the amount of, if it was kind of staged and everything, because I was down there and I saw the just the massive installations, et cetera, around the Kennedy Space Center, et cetera. But what an amazing amount of material and endeavor to not go and then say that you went.
Well, what could you have put that money toward instead of actually? Exactly. You could have essentially built a Star Wars system, couldn't you have?
Well, let's be fair, though. They did actually. The development of the missiles was really the development of ICBMs, and of course there was a propaganda war and all this other stuff. And there was an unstated a goal, because remember, Kennedy, who was assassinated, said prior to his death that we should be there by the end of the decade, and so there was a need to make that happen. Now, I'm not sure about the first one. I'm pretty sure we went, but the first one, I'm wondering about that. It makes me wonder if they couldn't make it in time, and that's why there was a little skullduggery going on. But clearly, there seems some clear evidence, like the dropping of the hammer and the feather and all that stuff, and makes me, I'd have to assume, like, because of the arc of the tires on certain, like, they were either in a giant vacuum chamber or they were on the moon. So at least that. Now, and obviously there's going to be like tons of engineering questions, just like you propose. Like, can you survive this? Is the magnetic shield of the Earth actually going to protect the moon as well? Does it affect all part? There's so many questions. Of course, the belts.
Well, it wouldn't. You know. No, it surely wouldn't.
Well, not all of it.
Does not go. No, at all. I mean, it touches the moon only in the magnetotail region, and it's It's kind of doubtful that you can call it protection. It's more like additional,
I suppose
trouble.
you're right. It's only going to affect certain things. You're right. I mean, because not everything is going to be affected by the magnetic field, and certainly not high energy photons or anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to add to your comment that Saturn V that launched Apollo, or supposedly launched.
Supposedly, here we are, like all being all creepy.
Yeah. Well, who knows?
Who knows, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it was actually not the ICBM. It was, I think, by that time when they were doing it, it was actually the first rocket that was built specifically for space exploration, not for launching the nuclear warheads and stuff.
Yeah, there was a big change. That was a huge beast compared to the ones they had before, like the Alan Shepard one, the Mercury, and so on. Yeah,
just go back and read what von Braun said it would take to get to the moon in the 1950s.
Hold on.
I've seen that. A huge missile.
Saturn V is actually the biggest rocket that ever flown to this date, even to this day.
It was amazing. I mean, you see that. You see that in person, and it's like it's amazing.
And Ben Allen recommended a polar trajectory.
I would have recommended one too. It's like, do you want to go through those belts? Well, it depends on how much you want to be dead.
Right there.
Well, those belts, the Van Allen belt A and B are different. Maybe Chris can speak to that a little bit because they are different. I believe.
Yeah, proton and electron. Yeah.
Yes. But just a quote from Wikipedia, take it for what it is.
Right.
The inner belt has particles zipping around with an energy of about 100 mega electron volt. Now, my question is that, I don't know about radiation safety limits, if you will. I'm not a nuclear engineer in that sense. But particles with 100 mega electron volts sound very hazardous for human and machine, to be honest.
I would think that a person saturated in that type of energy would vaporize.
From my understanding, the problem is once the ions hit your ship, which is basically aluminum, they start giving off like microwaves and so forth. So they are cooking things inside the ship and so forth. So I've heard lots of.
How would you get microwaves from 100 MeV? That's gamma rays.
Right.
Well, okay. I wasn't trying
to.
I was just remembering what they were talking about in this particular thing. So anyway,
it would have.
Allegedly there are protons.
Yeah.
With 100 MeV. So there are particles. That sounds utterly destructive to me.
Yes.
And apparently they go through phases and so forth. And,
yeah. I mean, well, I actually doubt that figure, but I don't know. I'm not an expert in Van Allen belts, not by a long shot, but 100 MeV, that's kind of like ultra relativistic protons, I would say. They're like 99% of the speed of light, basically, aren't they?
Well, there's one heck of a voltage apparently in that ring current. What's his name? Dr. Michael Claridge was talking about it, and he was saying, well, every few yards you went, it was another 30 volts, and these steps occurred at, there was literally millions of steps. So you're talking like 30 million volts in a current. I mean, that's going to whip material around like nobody's business, I'm sure. But
I read some specifications on satellite build outs, and they were requiring 120 mega electron volt protection shielding for all their electronics. So that's considerable. Obviously, they know there's high energy in space,
and they do talk about this now. Like that's one thing that they mentioned. Like they said, what's about going to Mars? What will we have to do? And they talk about it, and they talk specifically about how hard it is to get through these things. And I was like, well, then just use the same thing you went through last time. Like if you can stand on the moon without dying, then you can stand on the moon without dying, right? I mean, aren't they still alive? These people who went, so
Tesla.
Well, kind of to bring a point to the other side of the discussion, of course, I guess. Yeah. So, people, I mean, okay, we are not sure about the safety of human beings, let's say, but we definitely know that lots of, like, I'm talking about at least hundreds of space probes being launched exactly through these areas. For example, when you launch a satellite to geostationary orbit, you should pass through Van Allen belts, and they seem kind of okay. So,
I think that's a good point. The ability for a satellite to discharge electrical potential and that radiation build up in the shield. I understand it creates a plasma ion shield around the satellite.
It does.
With energy and induced into that system.
So it's getting a capacitance, sort of like a charge.
And I think Tesla talked about a Tesla shield, a mechanism by which to create an electromagnetic shielding for. And I know Boeing Corporation and Northrop Grumman's both been working on that technology as well. So,
the first satellites that went up weren't shielded, and you can see the results of that. Actually, it's the first pictures. I don't know if you ever have a chance to find them, and I'll see if I can locate them for people in the comments or whatever. But in the 1950s, the first satellites, the pictures they got back, because they had to send a satellite up, take pictures, and then it had to land, and they had to recover it, right? Because it's not something broadcast down or anything. But the pictures were using, basically had the emulsifier fluid and everything like that, and they were printed right onto something. But the footage that was on these things, you could see the sparks right across the film. Like, there was, unfortunately, they had no protection, so every time pieces of metal moved relative to each other, and the motors turned, they basically created voltage potentials, which caused sparks inside this, sealed box, which of course lit the whole thing up, right? So it became obvious after the first few that we sent up that we're going to have to deal with this stuff, which should have been a big hint, if you know. But to answer your question, Shifu, that you posted there, the first man is awesome because there's a Canadian as the main character. That's how that rolls. Just funny with you. What's his name there? Gosling, I think?
Anyway. Ryan Gosling, yeah.
Anyway.
That's actually a second time you're asking this question on this podcast. Yeah.
So I have a question for you electrical engineers, Neil, and others. Background, in a phase locked circuit, right? I did some work in DC communications with control systems and such, and in a phase locked circuit with any circuit that's has phases of two separate legs, for instance, on AC 220, or three-phase circuits coming into a field. You have a short phase to phase, or you can have a short phase to ground, right?
Right.
And I wonder if it's just a simple matter of phase locking with the sun to create that symbiosis, that homeostasis in the system. And is that the key to control of the sun? As simple as phase and how we perturb that system on Earth in phase with the sun and how that interface occurs.
That's a good question.
I don't know kind of the electrical side of things, but I just want to kind of reemphasize this notion that we are actually connected to the sun by the streams of the solar wind. It's the thing I was frequently mentioning in the chat of this podcast. The so-called Parker spiral, how the sun emits solar wind and at the same time it is rotating. So we are connected to some point on the solar surface, slightly to the right of the center, actually like halfway to the right limb, to the western limb, by these streams of solar plasma. And they, again, if you follow kind of mainstream heliophysics, plasma physics, they would say that these lines of solar wind correspond to lines of magnetic field. So there's a constant kind of magnetic flux falling onto the Earth. And since this is a moving plasma, moving magnetized conductor, essentially, it kind of could be considered as a generator of its own electric field. A moving conductor in a magnetic field creates an electric field. So there's an electric field of solar wind. Yeah. So this is basically it's. I think it's called the flux tube. This stream of plasma with following along the magnetic field lines, right?
Yes.
We might call it Berkland current if you like, but that is kind of, well, never mind. So anyway, the point I'm making is that we are connected to the sun, and this is not disputable. I mean, even mainstream acknowledges this connection.
Absolutely. They've called it magnetic flux ropes at different times.
Something like that, yes, yeah. Probably.
Yeah. And I think, when we talk about, like I mentioned earlier, a magnetic field is a product of an electric force, an electric field, and they have to be side by side. I don't know if you can have an electric field without a magnetic field. Is anyone aware of having a magnetic field without an electric field being present as well?
Actually, even permanent magnets are based on the charges moving inside of the magnet and mostly doing those in a spiral, which is why it has a magnetic field. So, no, they're all, as far as I know, and I've never seen anything that hasn't. But yes, there is a direct, I mean, the mathematics is clear. If you have this much magnetic flux and it is moving, you are generating this magnetic field, period. Like, just, but the, to answer, sorry.
Magnetic field as an effect, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's how this, it seems intuitive to me, personally. Right. Yeah.
But there is there's the cool thing that the reason we even see a lot of these things, like, I mean, the solar wind, if we weren't a solid body, most of this would just, pass on by us, obviously. But given the fact that the Earth is the Earth, there's a solid surface. This solid surface means that the ionosphere and, of course, the magnetic field must sort of move and adjust as it is subjected to the forces of this particle spiral solar wind. And as it goes over this, in a regular pattern, this movement of the ionosphere and so forth, this rippling, is likely the cause of most of the vibrations on, like, in my opinion, of the Earth, not just lightning storms. I think lightning storms might be a result of this, more or less. And the surface itself is, because it can't move, if there's movement on one plate, let's say the ionosphere, and it starts moving back and forth, it's going to induce currents on the ground because the ground can't move. So there's, it can, but it takes a bit.
We don't want to get trapped in a paradigm, right, where we say it can only happen in one way. I think EU Essentials 9.2 refers to that fact that magnetic field, right, can induce an electric force in a confined space or magnetic confined space, and vice versa. That, well, essentially we're talking about a plasmoid instability, a plasmoid or toroidal vortex, an electric force that can produce a magnetic field and vice versa. So it's a swinging door, guys. Magnetism can produce electric force can produce the magnetism, and we don't get trapped in that paradigm that we don't understand how it works and it interfaces together.
Well, yeah.
So your point is basically that the sun kind of connects to us. We are connected to the sun, but the sun is also connected to us. Is that what you're saying?
I believe that the research I've seen indicates there's a bidirectional flow in a Berkland current filament. So there's current flowing in both directions. And I think it's that tension that locks us. I think they're calling it quantum trapping effect, but essentially locks us into that rotation in a dynamic at a, faster than light connectivity, as Walt talks about. So there's no time lapse in the movement of objects at great distance. So,
if I may ask a question there, the Van Allen belts, the inner belt is a proton belt between brackets. The outer belt is an electron belt. If I listen to Donald Scott about the Berkland currents, I hear it's like a tube within a tube. And I hear that there are opposing directions, right? Back and forth, if you will.
Absolutely.
And that would be a proton and an electron going beam or current or whatever you want to call it, flow one way, the proton going to the left and the electron going to the right, if you will. Now, if I compare that to the Van Allen belts on the Earth, and to my mind, something like a wrapped around Berkland current, a wrapped around the Earth picture comes up. Is that a silly notion, or can you speak to that, or is there a connection there? How does that work?
Yeah, I think they've observed a Berkland current filament in what they're calling an electrojet in the both polar regions of the Earth, if I'm answering the question properly. And I think, oh shoot, for some reason that name just left me, but Bruce Leyburn talks about Joule antennas and the toroidal phenomena that occurs above points around the Earth as a sea urchin model, right? And I think there's a huge axial, right? And I think there's a huge axial potential around at both poles, as evidence from both DE1, DE2, and tide missions. So, I think Dr. Kongpop Uyen talks about Earth being 3/2 the wavelengths of light from the sun. And if you look at a sine wave, it seems to me the first planet is at the pinch point of the Bennett pinch point at the first half sine wave, and Mars and Mercury, and then you talk about the second planet being at the second pinch point of 2/2 the wavelength of light, and Earth being at 3/2 the wavelength of light. Seems to me that would be symbolic of an octaves, right? 8 planets, 8 octaves.
Yeah.
And 8 pinch points where those planets exist. I think Philip Francis sent me a picture of a null Earth image, which showed a triangular configuration of the wind currents at the South Pole. And we know that Mercury has a single dot at its North Pole, and Saturn has 6, an hexagonal configuration at its North Pole, the 6 planets. So, I'm just saying, is this connected? It very well is connected to a Berkland current filament in the wavelength of light from the sun, and why the planets are locked in or trapped into their orbit at those positions.
Doesn't
Jupiter have?
I'm sorry, we're all jumping in on that.
I actually can say, because I watched this Juno video right today. So Jupiter has 8 storms on the northern pole, but 5 on the southern.
Oh, that's,
and it's the fifth planet. So, but there's an interesting possibility here that this north-south.
Did you notice those are Fibonacci numbers?
Wow.
I don't know if you noticed that.
Are they?
Yeah, 8. And
I think Bruce talks about like just a number of the planet.
Oh no, it's just 8 and 5. Like they're.
I mean, Saturn has this hexagon, which is 6 storms essentially, and Jupiter has this 5 storms on South Pole. But anyway, I wanted to comment to Ido's question. So there's an important and kind of unrecognized, maybe, philological problem, I guess, in the EU community, that what EU people call Berkland currents are called just, we call everything Berkland current, in a way. We call any current that is aligned with a magnetic field a Berkland current. But this is not what regular physics does. In physics, the current that is aligned with a magnetic field is called field-aligned current, and that's all. But Berkland current again, in regular mainstream physics, is specifically the current that is flowing in the polar regions of the Earth, and maybe other planets, but mostly the Earth. So you've asked, about kind of the Van Allen belts possibly being the manifestations of Berkland current or something. So the kind of, taking into account what I've talked before, there is a Berkland current, but maybe there is a field-aligned current, which is kind of larger, that is also aligned, associated with Van Allen belts, right? That's what I'm saying. But these Berkland currents that kind of fall straight into the poles, they were actually pretty comprehensively studied in the recent years. There was a press release by ESA, European Space Agency. You probably know they have this SWARM mission. I'm not sure what is the acronym here, but it's called SWARM. It's 3 satellites with good magnetometers that are orbiting the Earth and measuring the magnetic field. So they've tried to basically measure these Berkland currents, what mainstream considers Berkland currents, right? So this is kind of only a part of what EU would consider a Berkland current, how do you call it, the specific case, right? So okay, so anyway, I think I said what I wanted. So.
Well, I thank you for that answer, Eugene. But if you see that picture that is on top left, I'm not sure who's sharing the screen there. It's whereby now, if I'm not mistaken, this is a depiction of the Berkland currents at the North Pole, for example, right? That's the stuff.
Yes. So this is exactly what mainstream names as a Berkland current. But
is it?
EU
That's
people,
my question first.
Oh,
is it?
So would EU consider this a Berkland current? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, because
that's a great question. Yeah.
Because it seems to me, and this is just me as I'm not an electric engineer, right? But if I look at that picture, I can see a flow coming in on the left and out on the right, and the other one is reversed. And that is that same mechanics, and that is allegedly a Berkland current, at least how it's explained. And so my question is, are these a direct result of those two Van Allen belts, if you will? The light brown, the darkish brown would be the inner belt, and the lightish brown orange would be the outer belt. That is my connection. I'm trying to understand how the Berkland currents that are there, allegedly, how they connect to this Earth system. Are they indeed going to the sun, or are they spreading around the Earth as a Van Allen belt? That's kind of my question. And if that is totally wrong, please tell me that is totally wrong.
Actually, the argument that you're having right now is the same argument that Berkland and Sidney Chapman had way back in way back when.
But we're not having an argument.
No. I just mean in regards to that debate. Is the magnetic field of the Earth a separate entity, like the magnetic field of a magnet, basically, or is it connected? And of course, this was the argument way back when, and it turns out, of course, that according to space probes and stuff, that it looks like Berkland was correct. And but I think what we're seeing is, in this particular case, the currents are obviously completely different in this, like what we normally see in a Berkland current, because the magnetic field is starting to pinch it down onto the globe, and then of course that's why we can see it, the aurora at all, because it's accelerated and pinched to such high densities that we can begin to see it, and it begins to cause synchrotron radiation and so forth. So anyway, just to answer your question.
And I think it's representative more of a funnel effect, a spiraling funnel, rather than a phenomenon as we see right there. And if you look at Kong-Pop's model as a wave function of light, then it may be indicative of a sine wave entry and a cosine wave exit at the South Pole along a trajectory. But I really like that discussion that Eugene was having with, I believe, Jim on, the alignment of the planetary axes. And so it's a good question. I don't know the answers, but I'm saying is that I perceive it as being a filamentary connection. It could be in a phi wave phenomena, as Eugene was describing, twisted along that core filament of a Berkland current where each planet exists. I don't know. So, but the Berkland current as defined by mainstream science is different than the EU's understanding from my understanding of Don's model. So I think it's a discussion. If you have a information or energy transfer along a plasma filament or waveguide, it should form very similar to the structure of Don's model for Berkland current. So if there is any type of electrical interface, it should form in that model when it's highly active.
I almost want to hear Jim pop on.
I wanted to. I'm not Jim, unfortunately, but I just wanted to kind of, I don't know, maybe finish, but maybe not this discussion. So I can answer to Ido that you can consider this, what mainstream calls Berkland current, a Berkland current in EU terms. It's just that mainstream only considers, this particular realization of EU's Berkland currents as Berkland currents.
Yeah, only this small part, if you will.
Yes. So yeah. They call only this part Berkland currents, whereas we refer to Berkland as Berkland currents to all the other possibilities. But these also demonstrate all the properties that, for example, Don Scott speaks about. They demonstrate counter rotation, and again that press release by ESA that I referred to previously clearly states that there are cylindrical shells of these currents with opposite direction of rotation. So this is a genuine EU Berkland current, and even mainstream names it Berkland current.
You could go up, Dave, if you would, a little bit. Besides that wonderful one showing the jumps across the equator there, up a little bit further, you can see the one that shows looks like it has butterfly
the red
wings.
and blue kind of
right in front of your mouse.
Okay,
there.
so
anyway,
and I also want to answer to Ido about the Van Allen belts. So the mainstream version of it, and I cannot guarantee that it is correct, but it basically boils down to the notion that what Van Allen belt is essentially kind of a storage of a charged particles that fall onto the Earth from everywhere, like the sun and the galaxy and stuff. And why they become kind of trapped in these zones is because, naturally charged particles follow magnetic field lines. This is just the way plasma behaves. But so they would kind of try to fall into the polar areas, right, where the magnetic field lines exit or enter the Earth's surface. But as they are doing that, as they are kind of trying to fall into the poles, of course, some of them do fall, and that's why we see auroras, for example. That's why we see higher radiation levels in polar areas and stuff. But many of these particles get kind of reflected from the poles because there is a higher density of magnetic field lines, if you like. There's a higher strength of the magnetic field. And just if you look at the equations that describe the dynamics of plasma, the higher magnetic field strength causes the particles to kind of reflect from this. This is one of the fundamental basics of how magnetic mirroring works. Maybe you know that in some of the plasma machines, they have, for example, two coils with current, and you can contain plasma between those coils of current, because the plasma would want to escape along the magnetic field lines through one of the coils, but as it approaches it encounters the higher magnetic field strength, and it reflects backwards. So it kind of bounces back and forth from one coil to the other, and pretty much this is the same as, this is exactly the picture. So imagine we took one of these coils and kind of, it's kind of a hard thing to imagine, but imagine we kind of invert this whole picture so that the particles are jumping not inside but outside. Mm-hmm. If you can, although I know it's pretty hard, but that would be the exact picture of Earth, where the particles jump outside of it in this torus, right? Kind of trying to reach those coils at the poles, but they cannot, at least some of them cannot, because there is this mirroring happening.
Well, and that's where you get the sort of like, because if you have a rotation in that, then you're going to have a ring around the middle of those charges, because that would be the Van Allen belt, so to speak, and you're having you're basically creating the Faraday effect. You're getting torque and rotation and so forth, and I can see the possibilities that you're looking at I guess you could say a more complex system, because it's a sphere. It's not going to do the disks thing. And you're going to have loops and so forth, which is what we see. We see this. We see the atmosphere and the plasma connections, which we've seen from that are actually there between the north and south hemispheres and so forth. So clearly, it's not as efficient. It's like recognizing that it's imperfect and it has a lot of inefficiencies in the system, which is probably why we have so much heat going on under the surface of our planet too. So,
starting to look like the counter-rotational dynamics of plasmoid instability to me.
Mm-hmm. That Bostek, being exposed to him a bit and diving in, and it's like that thing is really certainly resonating on many levels.
Oh yeah,
the plasmoid model, and if you start looking at these building blocks of fundamental geometries in relation to harmonics,
you start looking at the idea that the electron is a vortex phenomena, for instance.
Right.
So. I think we're on the cutting edge of discovery, and we'll eventually get to the answers, but a change in the atomic model, as Edwin's working on, is brilliant. I love the atomic geometry, and now we need to describe the electrical interfaces that occur between atoms and even subatomic particles in a dipole electrostatic force across the ether, as I believe exists, possibly terahertz frequencies, neutrinos, but the measurements of energies in space are astronomical.
There's a lot more there than we think, that's for sure.
2,900 tera electron volts measured, I think.
Amazing.
That is astronomical.
Literally.
Edwin,
I had to throw that in there.
Yeah, literally, yeah.
Then we start considering the phenomena of astrophysical masers and the ejection of essentially all the building blocks of nature. They talked about us being stardust. Well, maybe it wasn't dust. Maybe it was a plasma condensing into what we know as matter. Water on the Earth is a product of those phenomena in space. The Earth itself ejects water in huge quantities, so it's not a closed system.
Seems to
not
be
a closed loop.
Right. That's the message that seems to be going through. It's this continuum, that the missing piece of the model. It seems to me to be this. We've got the radiation part all together, but we don't have the other part where it comes back into a focal point. And we're seeing the things we've been exploring on the show is the sonoluminescence and then cavitation and all these things that seem to me to be part of the same system. It's just the other side of it.
I understand the phenomenon of cavitation well, and my question is, isn't that in fact a plasmoid instability, a hydrodynamic shear effect?
Seems like it, right?
Absolutely.
Well, water.
It almost seems like everything's cavitating in a way.
Water actually does carry charges, and because of the stuff that's inside of it. So technically, water moving it could technically be a weak plasma, and of course, under pressure, the certain dynamics would change. But I was thinking about the way that we only have a few more minutes, so I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to ask Chris some amazing questions. But the idea is that not just the sun and the earth and the connection there, but seeing what you were talking about, Dave, the idea that there is something that bridges these gaps, that is connecting all of this. And compared to the predictions that have been made, and we have to acknowledge in the electric universe or plasma cosmology models, either one, I'm not going to disparage either at this point or critique them, but they have been much more forthcoming compared to, if we think about it, how long before was it the lander that landed on Venus? It was a Russian lander, and before it got there, I mean, they had to know. They had to know because they made this thing incredibly tough with diamond lenses and everything else. It still only lasted 15 minutes on the surface of Venus, but their predictions were, it was just right up until they went there, they thought they were going to see trees and life underneath the clouds. So, and then of course then Carl Sagan comes in and goes, "Oh, it's so hot," even though Velikovsky predicted it, but it's so hot because of the global warming effect, the runaway global greenhouse gas thing. And that right there, that one statement is still affecting us today, because look what it's done. And it was an ad hoc throwaway comment, tried to explain without actually explaining, just making something out of your butt and just pulling it out there and throwing it down, which is not what science is supposed to do at all. You can't just keep on making ad hoc additions and keep on destroying the predictive accuracy of your model. And that alone should be reason enough for these people to turn and look. You know, like the electrical engineers, they say not only does the ether exist, and you're wrong there, and they've been saying it for 125 years, but hello, look at this. Look at what you have now. Look at what you're talking about. Magnetic field should have been your first hint. You know. Anyway, I'm done ranting. I've ranted away now. Someone else. Question this man.
I just want to have I'm sorry. I just want to have a short comment about. I mean, you mentioned life on Venus and things. So there's a guy in Russian, kind of a more or less mainstream scientific community, although he's pretty old, that have basically spent the last, I don't know, couple of decades of his life, I guess, in studying the pictures of these Soviet probes that went to Venus. And he's kind of obsessed with the idea that they actually resemble, that something is moving there, so those might be like alive organisms or something.
Well, that actually surprised me. Look at what we have we thought that there would be no life at the vents of the black smokers on the mid-ocean ridges. And yet we go down there to this dark and sulfurous atmosphere, and bacteria live right on the side of that thing. So it wouldn't surprise me at 900 degrees. It might be possible.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention this because there's a whole community of people studying the pictures of Mars and like seeing all kinds of stuff there. Yeah,
but that could also be looking at clouds too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I just wanted to mention that there's this thing about Venus too. So yeah,
I've heard about that before, Eugene. Not very much, but I did come across it. It was very fascinating, and at first I discarded the notion, kind of, sort of, like being in the realm of out there, because Venus is way too hot. but then you learn about organisms in the deep oceans that are under high pressure and can resist higher temperatures, right? And then you go to Venus, and that's a high pressurized atmosphere with a high temperature. And then you learn, at least that's what I've heard a few years ago, that I think it was Russian probes, because they have been exploring Venus much more, that the poles are actually quite cold. And I mean cold. So if the poles are cold and there's a cold region, is there not even if it's a mixed small region of more acceptable conditions for life? So at first I found myself discarding the notion of the potential of having life on Venus. I discarded it completely. I became much more cautious. Let's put it that way.
Well, to be perfectly fair, though, we do have someone who I think would be kind to say we owe an intellectual debt to, Sir Fred Hoyle, who was the father of the panspermia theory, and a lot of his ideas came from the idea that Venus's closest approach on a new moon, which happens every so many years, would allow Venus to connect to the Earth, its plasma sheaths, and 45 days later, we get massive flu viruses go through the atmosphere. So that was his proposition, of course. Now, I'm not actually one way or the other. I'm just happy to explain it because he also backs up that claim in that sense. So.
Roel Rife, on that note, Neil, Roel Rife suggested that a virus or bacteria couldn't exist without a precursor frequency oscillation. So is it possible that those frequency changes from other planetary bodies, like we talk about the Andromeda strain and things like that,
Love that movie.
Yeah, and how that
they trigger it,
and how that connects to maybe it's you look at Dr. Luc Montier's work in the transfer of DNA or RNA signal across fiber optics from computer to computer across continents, and the restructuring of that RNA in a dilute solution. So I'm saying is it the virus coming across space as a virus in form, or is it actually a frequency that mutates or creates a new virus form on this planet?
I would actually mention, I need to mention this because without this name, this discussion would be incomplete, I feel, that Velikovsky says that it is possible that some of these, his idea that Venus probably approached the Earth not very long time ago, like maybe a couple of thousands of years ago or something like that. So he had this idea that in worlds in collision in particular, he says that maybe some of these biblical epidemics were caused by basically germs from Venus, if you like, that fell onto the Earth during its close approach to Earth.
It's the same concept,
Makes me wonder about plagues and other things like that. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that was the key for me, was understanding that the transfer of virus doesn't have to happen in material form. It can happen through the electromagnetic signal, and therefore causing that virus to form in that location that the frequency oscillation is consistent with its mutation. So
we saw that on the plasma in space. Those Russians were doing the thing, and they sort of made a DNA chain just by virtue of the particles they were moving around that looked like a DNA chain, obviously. But
Neil, I have a question for you. You said that there was 40-day lag.
45.
So I've just had a flash of, I don't know, intuition. I was talking about Parker spiral, curving because of the rotation of the sun. So it would actually cause some lag for these magnetic field lines to connect Venus and Earth. Oh. So Venus and Earth would be connected with solar wind, not when they are at the exact conjunction with this. The Venus is in conjunction with the sun, but at least few weeks later, maybe even a month later. I haven't looked into that in particular, but I don't know.
Interesting.
Maybe there is something.
Well, actually,
You know?
I was about to say something else that was crazy. That seems to be backing us up. There's tales. If we go into catastrophism, just to back up your biblical thing, but this is not biblical necessarily. It refers to a story in China that talked about a cloud that crossed over the mountains and killed every single person it touched. So, and it was like a lethal, I don't know what it was, but they report that happened, and it killed so many people apparently. So who knows?
in the last few years, there's been reports of thunderstorms in Australia that create asthma outbreaks. That filled all the hospitals. They had to put tents out in the parking lot. And then
I wonder if that was ionization or something. I don't know.
I connected that to extremely low frequency oscillation that was done on ELF harmonics, which we're talking about as an Alphen wave, right? ELF harmonic, Alphen wave. In the upper atmosphere, or rather in test laboratory, that creates asthma outbreaks in patients. So I'm saying there's a connection by scientific research that shows it can happen. We know that thunderstorms, the electrical potential in a thunderstorm can be induced through an electrical force such as an Alphen wave. So in the southern hemisphere, if they're creating Alphen waves in the southern hemisphere, is it possible that they're inducing those outbreaks of asthma in those locations? And is it possible for the outbreaks of influenza, for that matter, globally, to be a product of the changing frequencies of our planet?
Well, now Sir Fred Hoyle loves you. Sorry.
Would you think it's responsible for the Peter Mungo-Jupp's theory of the polyploidy?
Yes. In fact, that Wallace line was critical to my understanding of how different geopathic stress zones can produce variations and mutations in life forms. So I think that's far more superior than Darwin's, ideas of evolution.